Hello and welcome to another GIS report with Health in Perspective. Reporting for the Ministry of Health and Social Development, I am Public Health Communications Specialist Natasha Letsum. Recently, the Ministry of Health and Social Development issued a press release urging residents of the Virgin Islands to remain vigilant about reducing mosquito breeding sites in light of the recently issued Zika alert for the Caribbean. Today on the program, as we continue to educate the community about Zika and its risks, we have with us Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Ronald Georges, and the Acting Chief Environmental Health Officer, Mrs. Yolanda Penn. Thank you both for joining the program.
Thank you very much, Natasha.
Now, to get us started, tell us the 411 on Zika.
Okay, yeah. So Zika virus, very similar. You recall last year, chikungunya virus was introduced to the region. So similarly, Zika virus is a virus originally identified in Africa in 1940s. Was active there in the eastern areas of the world, and has slowly made its way across to the West. Earlier last year, it was identified in South America and has made its way up through Central America and now is introduced into many territories in the Caribbean. Very similar to chikungunya and dengue. The symptoms are very similar. Zika is a much milder illness. It's characterized by fever, joint pains, muscle pains, and some redness in the eyes as well. So generally tends to be a much milder illness than both chikungunya and dengue. So as I mentioned, it has been introduced in the region, and many territories in the region have identified Zika virus in their populations. The closest being St. Croix, U.S. Virgin Islands. We are yet to identify a case here in Tortola.
Okay, well, thank you for that information. We will definitely touch more on a lot of what you've said, but just following my list of questions, I want to ask you now at this point, how is the disease spread?
Right, the disease is spread by the Aedes aegypti mosquito, the same vector that spreads chikungunya and dengue. All right, we actually have a picture of it here, and it's that black mosquito with white stripes. The mosquito is a domesticated mosquito. Right? The mosquito is basically adapted to live around our homes and houses in clear water, where it breeds, and also in the community. So it's not a mosquito that lives for example, in the swamps or in the ponds and etc. It's, for want of a better word, it's one of our pets almost. It's here because of our activity. So this mosquito spreads, as I mentioned before, chikungunya, dengue, and Zika virus.
Okay. What are the symptoms of Zika? You said it's a bit milder than chikungunya. Tell us a little bit about these symptoms.
Right, so similar symptoms, febrile illness with joint pains, muscle pains, back pain, potentially pain behind the eyes, and also redness in the eyes. So very similar symptoms to both dengue and chikungunya. So whereas chikungunya had a lot more joint pains, dengue tends to have a lot more back pain, muscle pain, retroorbital pain. There's a lot of similarities between the symptoms, but just slight differences. Main thing being it's fever, so it's febrile illness, right? So we've had some questions with folks who, for example, have had red eye. So if you have one or two of the symptoms, it's not likely that you have one of these illnesses, but you must have a fever.
And I was reading somewhere that cases of Zika are mostly dormant. 1 in 4 persons actually feel the effect. So speak a little bit to that.
Right. So in public health, we look at the tip of the iceberg. So at the tip of the iceberg, what's above the water, if you think of an iceberg, it's shaped like this, and just the tip is above, that's the clinical cases that come to light. Right. So those are people who have more severe illness, would go to see the doctor, would probably have some treatments, or would complain. But under the water are all of those persons who may have been exposed to a virus and their body is able to deal with the situation. Perhaps they didn't have a severe illness, or perhaps they had absolutely no illness at all. And that's very typical with many viral diseases. And chikungunya, dengue, and Zika are no exception from that.
I know earlier during your first response, you alluded a bit to the domestication of this mosquito and how it lives with us. And that's basically that makes it special as to why you transmit so much of these vector illnesses. But go a bit more in depth in terms of why we should really take care of our surroundings to reduce these mosquitoes.
Right, so as you said, the mosquito is really adapted to live in our domestic environments. And it's because of our activities why the mosquitoes continue to breed around our homes. So as I mentioned, because it's our activities, we can do something about it, right? So that is why, for example, we have and Miss Penn will go into more detail, but we have a poster which we have shared with the community and which I think for a number of years it's been around, which shows all the different potential breeding sites around our home, right? In our environment, what we have found is gutters clogged with leaves, trap water, garbage, bottle caps, bottles, buckets, plants, the bromeliad plants, which have a little area in them which can trap water, pet containers, uncovered cisterns, cistern overflows. Mosquitoes are, they're so adept at looking for water, they'd actually even go down your, the gutter pipes to get into your cistern, So I mean, things like all of those areas you have to actually be able to inspect and deal with to remove the breeding sites. The adult mosquitoes love dark, cool areas, right? So during the day, they'll find their way into our homes, they'll be in our closets, behind curtains, right? So these are the areas where the mosquitoes tend to hang out. And more so during the mornings and evenings, they will bite. But then, of course, if there's a host nearby, they'll bite during the day as well, right? So, there's a lot of questions come up in the community about fogging and etc. But the fact of the matter remains that Environmental Health Department will fog with a truck on the road. That fog is not going to get into your closet, behind your curtain, underneath your bed, right, behind the dresser to kill adult mosquitoes. And even if it did, right, we would have another crop of mosquitoes coming up next week. So for fogging to be effective, we would have to fog the whole island repeatedly every week, right? Because we're only killing adult mosquitoes. And after we've killed that crop of adults, what we have is another crop of adults coming up because we have not dealt with the larvae and the pupae, which are breeding in those same areas which I described.
Well, before we go more in depth about the life cycle of the mosquito and other precautions that can be taken to reduce mosquito breeding sites, I want to go back a bit and talk about the impact that Zika is having right now. You mentioned earlier that in our neighboring Virgin Islands and St. Croix, they've diagnosed a case. I know a lot of messaging surrounding Zika involves pregnant women.
Right.
How are pregnant women at risk when we're talking about Zika?
Right. So there are two things that I think, have led to a lot of panic and scare in the media with regards to Zika. The first being the suspected link between Zika virus infection in the first trimester of pregnancy, that is the first 3 months of pregnancy, when the baby's organs and systems are being formed, and the potential for the virus to cause problems. And the first issue was that last year, in a series of about 35 cases of microcephaly, so that's basically a baby born with a small head, so specific deformity, they identified Zika virus. Now, the thing of it is that it's a suspected connection, right? That does not demonstrate a causal link. If you think of a situation where you have widespread viral infection of a population, right, and you find a disease which is perhaps a little more, you think it may be prevalent or it may be a statistical anomaly, you're very likely to find the virus, right, in those cases, but it does not establish a causal link. So because of that suspicion, there's a lot more surveillance being done on cases of microcephaly to try to elucidate whether there's a link. That seems to have created a lot of scare in the mainstream media, where you get the impression that they're saying that there is a causal link and that women should avoid pregnancy or not go to areas where they may be infected by Zika. But before the program we were talking about measles, right, rubella, chickenpox. Lots of viruses cause problems in pregnancy, and we don't create such a scare about it, right? I'm not saying this to say that this is something that we should minimize, but definitely something that we have to take on board. The other thing that has come up in the media recently is Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is an ascending paralysis, which lasts a couple of months in most cases, and people recover completely. Guillain-Barré syndrome as well is not well understood. It is thought to be caused by many viruses, and it is thought that perhaps there may be a link between Zika and Guillain-Barré syndrome. Again, these are all not causal links, but again, things for people to be aware of. So, you know, for pregnant women, they're one of the high-risk groups. And any kind of viral infection or any kind of disease can cause problems. So pregnant women should really try to avoid getting either of the 3 viruses. And I think later in the program we'll talk more about ways to protect yourself.
No, good information, because I know that, you know, down to yesterday there was a situation on BVI Community Bulletin Board talking about, you know, we have a case of Zika here, and, you know, doctors telling patients to leave the island. What do you say to something like that? You have people on BVI Bulletin Board saying that we have a case. Do we have a confirmed case of Zika?
From our information, we do not, right? We would see the tests that go out, and we would see the results that come back in. And at this point, we don't have a confirmed case. Right, we don't have a confirmed case of Zika virus. Okay, so we can say that with confidence.
Okay, great. And what about you hear the advisories? You're hearing, you know, people telling travelers, okay, if you're pregnant, don't come to these regions. But what is the message for people who live here? If we have Zika in a neighboring community, realistically, it wouldn't be long before it reaches to our shores. And we're going to talk about protecting our borders in a little bit, but I want to get to the messaging for pregnant women here. What do they need to do right now to protect themselves? We don't know if Zika causes microcephaly. If I was a pregnant woman, I wouldn't want to find out.
Exactly.
So what should pregnant people do?
Yeah, I agree completely with what you're saying. We need to look at it as an inevitability, right? The same way that chikungunya made its trek across the Americas, we have to look at Zika doing the same thing. So eventually we will have a confirmed case in the British Virgin Islands. Like for all the other viruses, pregnant women need to take precautions because they are a high-risk group. If they're infected with dengue, chikungunya, and Zika the same, right? So simple precautionary measures that we have discussed, you know, previously for chikungunya, to avoid getting mosquito bites by using the mosquito repellents, right? Avoiding being bitten. The same messages that we have about your environment, right? So around where you live, where you work, etc. Some areas may be outside of your control. So for example, you're going to the grocery or you're going somewhere where obviously you don't have the control over that environment, and that's where you protect yourself, right? So you use the mosquito repellents. If you're around dusk or dawn, you can wear long clothes, right, to protect yourself from being bitten. Right? So that's basically what I would, you know, advise. I mean, each person has to understand their own risk, right, and understand their own decision. So if somebody wants to make a decision not to come to the territory, that's one thing. But for a woman who lives here to try to relocate because of a potential risk, I think it's a bit unreasonable for us to ask them to do that.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Georges. Mrs. Penn, thank you for being patient with us as we had to get some of that information out. Now, we want to turn our focus a bit on the environmental health aspect of it. How are we protecting our borders? We're worrying about people not coming here, but we really should be, you know, protecting our borders. What are we doing with that regard?
Well, we continue with border protection procedures that are already in place, but certainly at this time we would try to heighten those things and include all elements of border protection, which would be port health, immigration, and customs, to make sure everyone is aware of what to look for and to help, you know, support the borders or protect the borders in that regard. There's also signage that could be used, various posters and health alerts that could be distributed to travelers as they enter the BVI, advising them of certain symptoms that would need to be reported as early as possible so that we could identify any cases as quickly as we could.
Okay. Now, the CARFA and a lot of these regional institutions are putting a lot of pressure on environmental health departments across the Caribbean, right?
Yes.
When it comes to vector control. What are we doing here? How is the environmental health department controlling vector?
Well, the vector control division is to the leader as far as in the country to protect individuals from vector-borne diseases. So we do have a tremendous responsibility. But right now what we're trying to do is get the message out that, as Dr. Georges has already discussed, that we have to get people to take ownership of their surroundings. And I would like the phrase to go out, make it personal, as far as protecting yourself against these vector-borne diseases. And when I say make it personal, the Aedes mosquito has a flight range of approximately 100 meters or 300 feet. And so if you could imagine if every person would say within a radius of 300 feet around me, I'm going to make sure there's no mosquito breeding, the impact that would have on reducing illnesses. So I would say that over and over, make it very personal, especially pregnant women and anyone living with a pregnant person or associated with that person should take on themselves to make the extra effort to ensure that there is no breeding sites around that person. Because again, the most important thing is to know what the vector looks like. The mosquito in the picture is there. It's black and it has the white stripes on the body and the leg. And once you know what it looks like, you can better protect yourself. If you see it, you would know that it's probably breeding within 100 meters of where you are. So that should prompt you to begin inspecting the premises. And that should be done weekly. Every week, take a few minutes to go around the premises and ensure that there's no breeding place for the mosquito. In other words, where did it come from? So you know what it looks like, you inspect for any problems, and then you try to correct that problem. Maybe you go out in your yard and you see that the pet container it has water in it, right? So you just dump it out, right? You see that the cistern or the water storage tank, the lid is slightly off. You put it back in place, secure it, you cut off the breeding sites. And that's what our environmental health officers are doing. I mean, even when they're out, not necessarily a vector control officer, but maybe an environmental health officer, maybe in the field. And when they see containers that are holding water, they would try to dump them out. There was one occasion recently where 3 officers were out together and they noticed a boat that was full of water, and there was literally thousands of wrigglers in the boat, wrigglers or larvae, mosquito larvae in there. And the 3 of them could not budge the boat to try to lift it over. But fortunately, once the community became aware of the problem, they took action and they removed the boat. So that was a win for everybody.
Now, I have to ask you because the community wants to know about the fogging. You know, even though your people might step up, and we're hoping that they will, and you know, like you said, make it personal and ensure that their space is not a mosquito breeding area. We still like to know that you guys come around and fog every now and then. So talk to me about fogging efforts that you're going to continue.
Yeah, the fogging campaign began in December and would continue throughout this year. So that's a norm that will happen, but I would urge people not to rely solely on the fogging because, as Dr. Georges has already said, that alone would not protect you from a vector-borne disease. It really is about inspecting your premise weekly to ensure that you're not breeding the mosquito. It's so important. I can't say it enough times.
And you guys keep saying weekly. Why is every week important?
Well, because if you allow the water to sit for up to a week, then that means that the mosquito larvae, that's the time span that they need to go through their life cycle. So if you don't turn the water over, then you're going to have whatever's there is going to come out. You'll see it in a week or 7 days. But if you're emptying it, you're going to prevent that from happening.
Now, you spoke about protecting pregnant women. What about measures as a community to, assist perhaps the elderly or persons that, are not able to conduct inspections or, upkeep their property for themselves,
Right.
what type of messages would you send on that?
Well, I guess one, I would say if you know of someone elderly, try to look out for them and do what you can. But part of the vector control program is premise-to-premise inspections. And so every single premise is looked at. And if they would come across a place where there is a problem and they know that an elderly person is there, we could work with community organizations to make sure that that property is dealt with, that it's cleaned up properly.
So, in terms of caring for the property, now we're talking about home, we're talking about individual premises. What messages do you have for businesses? What messages are we sending for the schools? Because if this is truly a community effort, then we have to look at each cross section of the community. So, speak a bit about what would you like to see from businesses and schools.
Right. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because we're actually trying to start IMS Dengue, which is Integrated Management Strategy for these vector-borne diseases. And that would mean involvement from every sector, as you say. And it's not in place yet, but hopefully coming soon, where we would have a group of individuals, decision makers from each area, like, for example, the Tourist Board, Public Works, Department of Waste Management. You would have schools, the Ministry of Education involved. All those, and the list goes on, I'm sure, but these are the ones that are coming off the top of my head. But you would have those individuals in, and we would actually come up with what each individual group can do to help with the problem. So, for example, let's say Public Works is involved, then they would make sure that contractors and builders would know that when you work in a work site, you don't allow, an open, unfinished cistern or something that could collect water. You turn over buckets. You don't allow an accumulation of tires on the site. Ministry of Education could come on and have their maintenance men from their schools collected together. We could train them. The vector guys could train them on what to look for, how to survey their premises, their school grounds, to make sure there's no breeding place. Same with Tourist Board. We could have representatives from the hotel industries to come in and get trained. There's been success with that type of thing for a marina in the territory that selected a person to look over their property, and we haven't had any problems with that since. And before, it was very high risk as far as reports of mosquito-borne diseases. So the integrated management strategy is going to be really effective, I think, when it gets in place.
I'd just like to come back to that point that Yolanda made with regards to the marina. That area where that marina was located was always been a hotbed for transmission. And as she was saying, it was traced back to the same similar issues with boats and different water collection points where mosquito breeding would take place. And since environmental health has been able to work closely with that marina does its own inspections on a weekly basis and deals with all breeding sites. That whole community is no longer a hotspot, right? So, I mean, coming back to your question about the schools and business places, that's something that schools and business places can do. Identify one individual with the responsibility each week to walk around the premise and identify areas where water is being collected and remediate right away. Because that simple action can deal with a lot of mosquito breeding and significantly reduce the risk of the communities around these schools and business places to vector-borne diseases.
Now, as you spoke about vector hotspots, what are some of the hotspots here locally that persons living in these areas could really, jump on board to help reduce the indices?
Well, I need more of what do you mean by hotspots?
The vector spots. Where are the places, Tortola, Virgin Gorda, Jocelyn Dyke, Anicada, that promote most mosquito breeding?
I mean, they have the highest transmission rates and the highest indices. Right. You want us to name communities?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't want to put anybody in a
I mean, it's good to know because if we're talking about lowering vector-borne illnesses. We're so concerned that Zika is coming to our shores. If we have areas in the community that need attention, I think it needs to be brought to the forefront and let the people in the community, while we want everybody to do it, but we want these specific community to pay keener interest in it to help us lower
I think a way we can phrase it without basically calling out any community specifically is that what we've noticed over the years is a lot of the transmission happens in the densely populated areas, which are in the lower, like closer to the main roads and stuff like that. So we have not seen a lot of transmission up in the country, like up in the hills, where houses are further apart. But lower down, where the houses are very, very densely populated, that's where most of the transmission occurs. And you could think of all the communities in Tortola that are very densely populated in the lower lying areas. And all of those are hotspots for transmission.
Okay.
How's that?
Yeah, that's good. Thanks a lot. But what we're also doing is I have asked for a list of repeat high risk, repeat offenders. In other words, when the vector guys are going out and they're seeing that every time we come past this place, it has containers, it has derelict boats. And I ask for that list so that we can begin to take further action to make sure those areas get cleaned up.
You're talking about legal action?
Yeah.
Okay. And I know some time back you were issuing notices about people with derelict boats. How is that situation right now?
Well, that would be more, I think, Department of Waste Management, that they would tag the vehicle or the boat or whatever. But I think that system is still in place, that they would mark it, label it, and once it's not moved, they would go ahead and be able to move it.
Okay. Yeah. Now, we spoke at length about, being, personal with this mosquito, cleaning your surroundings. Dr. Georges, you told us about the risk. But, people need to connect on an emotional level at times. So, how would you motivate the person that is watching this program right now to assist you, to assist us in reducing these mosquito breeding sites?
Well, I would say the motivation would be to stay healthy. I mean, you're no good, you can't do anything when you're not feeling good. There was a study done on 3 species of the Aedes mosquito and the ability of that mosquito to spread disease to humans. It was found that the Aegypti species was the most likely to spread disease to humans due to the fact that it's almost exclusively due to its almost exclusive preference to bite humans. Of the 3 species looked at, the Aedes aegypti was 95% human blood. The albopictus was 75% human blood, and the other species, which was the Mediovitatus was less than 50%. So, the Aedes aegypti prefers to bite us, and like I said, you want to be healthy, make it personal, make sure you're not breeding mosquitoes within 100 meters.
Yeah, I think as well, when we had the initial sets of outbreaks of chikungunya in Jos Van Dyke, we had some, and we went through the community, we had some conversations with folks, and some folks had people who had this new disease in their household, and they took this, like, this is really serious. And I remember a guy in particular, I can't recall his name, but he made a point of cleaning up his yard and advocating for his neighbor's yard to be cleaned completely, because he didn't want anybody else in his family to have to go through that. And he was very, very personal about it. So, the thing is, these illnesses, yes, we say, Zika is potentially a very mild illness, but it has some serious potential complications. We know chikungunya, we know dengue. I think we just need to take our responsibility seriously, and do what we know we need to do.
Nice. Dr. Georges, I want you to talk a minute for me to the tourism sector.
Right.
With Zika, you're hearing all these messages like you alluded to earlier, talking about, people should refrain from travel, especially if you're pregnant and what's not. But, we're a society that thrives on tourism, and we need to ensure that our tourism product stays healthy. So what type of counsel, what type of advice can you give to that sector so they can strengthen their capacity to reduce their vulnerability to
Right.
Zika?
A couple of things. I mean, I think from the tourist board standpoint, we need to have some positive, some messaging going out. We're getting a lot of negative messaging coming from, these very strong authorities, the CDC, the U.S. government, talking about the risk, and the mainstream media is, really hyping up the potential link between Guillain-Barré and microcephaly. So there's a lot of scaring going on in the community, there's a lot of unknowns out there, and the traveling community, there's a lot of negative messages going out there. So it's important for some of the positive messages to go out. For example, what Ms. Penn was talking about, what's being done locally, what's being done in the region to deal with the situation, and the true risk of these viruses to travelers, and how they can protect themselves and significantly reduce their risk of having any of these illnesses or potential complications. So those type of messages need to go out very strongly from the tourism sector. The other thing I think the tourism sector in the BVI needs to do, very seriously as well, is that same experience we have with that marina, right? So all properties in the territory need to take on board vector control very seriously as part of their responsibility, right? Doing those regular inspections, having information for their guests so they know how to protect themselves, what's their risk, etc. There are a number of novel technologies out there now. For example, there are repellents and attractants and traps and all sorts of things. So they can begin looking at some of those things that they can also use on their properties to help protect their guests. So I think rather than just laying back and thinking that this is something that the Ministry of Health should deal with, the tourism sector needs to take it very seriously and be very proactive. So they need to make sure they're having very positive messaging going out, saying how we did be dealing with the issue, what the true risks might be, and how their guests can protect themselves. And then they also need to do something about it on the properties by doing, having the systems in place for those regular inspections and all these other array of preventative things that they can do. And having all of those messages going out, we can let people know that, okay, yes, Zika is in the region, but here's what the BVI is doing about it to make your trip here safe. And I think that's really a role that the tourism sector has to take on board very strongly and own.
Thank you very much. Now, Mrs. Penn, I'll allow you this opportunity to make any final thoughts.
Final thoughts. I would just say we need to continue with what we've said and support all the efforts that everyone's doing as far as trying to clean up. And I would urge individuals to contact the Environmental Health Division for training or for any other questions they may have. But the most important thing is to take responsibility, make it personal, and survey your property, because even though the vector control unit is doing premise-to-premise inspections, they're not going to be at your premise every week. So you need to do that inspection yourself.
Dr. Georgia?
Yeah, I think just to tag on to what Ms. Penn is saying there, as a member of the public, we need to not be paralyzed by the messages of fear that we're seeing in the media, to take it personal, as she says, and to be proactive, right? To get some real knowledge about what's going on and what we can do personally to protect ourselves, to protect our community, and to prevent transmission of these vector-borne diseases.
Well, thank you very much to the both of you for coming on the program today and, allaying some of these fears and concerns that the people of the community have regarding Zika, and for sharing this wealth of information with us. And I really do like that message, make it personal, and we hope it resonates well with the members of the community. So once again, I would like to thank you for coming on the program.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you for tuning in to this GIS feature, where we updated you on information regarding Zika and what we can do collectively to reduce our risk. We would like persons to conduct weekly surveys of our premises for any signs of mosquito breeding. Efforts must be focused on source reduction, and cleanup should include the elimination of unwanted containers that can hold water, properly covering water storage receptacles such as tanks and cisterns, and sealing septic tanks and soakaways. The best defense against vector-borne illnesses like Zika, dengue fever, and chikungunya is to have a great offense. Reduce mosquito breeding sites individually and collectively. Let us fight the bite together. Remember, make it personal. Reporting for the Ministry of Health and Social Development, I am Public Health Communications Specialist Natasha Letsom. Thanks for tuning in.